History as it happens, January 19th, 2021. Inauguration.
I, Richard Bill House Nixon.
I, Jimmy Carter, do solemnly swear.
I, Ronald Reagan.
George Herbert Walker Bush.
William Jefferson Clinton, do solemnly swear
that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
Preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States.
So help you God.
So help me God.
The peaceful transition of power, a pillar of American democracy. But this year, a fear of violence hangs over Washington. As one president departs, impeached for a second time, his successor calls for unity. As we report History as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin Di Caro.
Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
Government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem.
We must do what America does best. Offer more opportunity to all and demand more responsibility from all.
Let us answer the call of history and carry into an uncertain future that precious light of freedom.
Hello, everybody. Inauguration Day is usually a time of anticipation and excitement as the winners prepare to set the tone for the next 4 years, and those who either lost the election or have simply served out their term graciously step aside. But this year has been different.
What happened here today was an insurrection incited by the President of the United States.
When a pro-Trump mob assaulted the Capitol, it marked the violent culmination of months of verbal attacks by the outgoing president on the electoral process, and he did so 4 years after saying this in his own inaugural address, January 2017.
This American carnage stops right here and stops right now.
On January 6th, law and order was stood on its head. Blood and chaos spilled from the halls of Congress. Now Joe Biden inherits a nation divided along partisan and ideological lines. Americans see their political opponents as enemies. There are parallels between this moment and episodes in the American past, but before we explore that history, let's look at what's about to happen. Joe Biden and his inaugural address, with Washington Times White House reporter Dave Boyer. Joe Biden might be excited merely to have the stage to himself finally. He gets to set the tone for the next 4 years, Dave. It's been unsettling to witness the grip Donald Trump continues to hold on the country during a time when the sitting president or the outgoing president is usually in the background before an inauguration.
I think Joe Biden will be relieved in a way to, like, as you say, have the stage to himself. I'm actually wondering how much of the stage he will have to himself, even though Trump isn't going to be on stage with him. Trump is trying to plan some kind of a grand departure from the White House on the morning of the inauguration. And I imagine we're going to see another wave of pardons at some point, whether he chooses to do that at the very last minute or sometime in the days before that. But Joe Biden will be able to finally, after he takes the oath, begin setting his agenda. He's already laid out his plans, the $1.9 trillion economic relief plan and fighting COVID.
Nice segue there. What can we expect from Biden in his inaugural address? Because it's usually not a time for policy proposals. He wants to set a tone. He wants to call for unity, correct?
That's right, especially after the way the post-election period has gone, with Trump claiming that Biden and his troops stole the election from him. Biden does want to reach out and smooth over the waters to the extent that he can. He's also facing a narrowly divided Congress, even though Democrats will control the Senate and the House. The margins are razor thin in both chambers. So he's going to need to work with Republicans to get pretty much anything done in the next year.
Both parties are bickering now, though, about what unity actually means. But Joe Biden so far has been pretty quiet about what should happen to Donald Trump.
Yes, and I think that's partly because, as I just said, he's looking at such a narrow Democratic majority in both the Senate and the House. He doesn't want to take away their power from their base, and their base is calling for Trump's hide in almost every respect. And Senate Democrats are going to try to push through, this impeachment trial even after Trump leaves office to prevent Trump from ever running for president again. And Biden has not waded into that. He's basically saying to Pelosi and Schumer, you guys decide. If he truly is interested in a message of harmony and reaching out to the other party, he should have made his feelings known. And I think this impeachment trial is going to only set back his agenda in the early days of the Congress.
And when it comes to bipartisanship, Dave Boyer, and reaching across the aisle, Joe Biden has often invoked his time in the Senate many years ago when he had to work with Republicans with whom he disagreed on any number of issues. But Congress, and the Senate especially, has changed quite a bit since he last served in it 12 years ago.
The partisan divide has just grown ever sharper in the years since Biden served in the Senate. I'm not sure he's going to recognize the chamber that he left 12 years ago.
The House is usually known as the more partisan or polarized chamber, but the Senate certainly has its share of ideologues on the right. Josh Hawley and Ted Cruz have come in for severe criticism because they continue to push this lie that something happened with the election.
And you've got Democrats who are still furious at Hawley and Cruz for what they tried to do and are even calling for them to be expelled or censured in some way. That's the new Senate that Joe Biden is dealing with.
David Boyer, Washington Times White House reporter. Good luck and stay safe on Inauguration Day. D.C. does look like a fortress, evoking memories of March 1861, when soldiers and sharpshooters guarded the arrival of Abraham Lincoln. Joe Biden has monumental challenges on his hands, but no one took office under such dire circumstances as Lincoln. This we know. And he, by the way, was the second president to be inaugurated that year. The first was Jefferson Davis, Confederate States of America. When I saw a Confederate flag hoisted by a January 6th rioter, I wondered whether there's anything about Lincoln's time that might help us get our minds wrapped around the dimensions of today's crisis. So let's say hello to Paul Quigley, the director of the Virginia Center for Civil War Studies at Virginia Tech. Professor Quigley, Joe Biden will call for unity. Abraham Lincoln did the same thing. He appealed to the better angels of our nature, but his olive branch failed, right?
So he certainly held out an olive branch. And, it was interesting. You referred to it as a failed olive branch, which it was in many respects because, the Confederacy went off in its own direction and the Civil War was fought. But in another sense, the olive branch did work for other parts of the U.S. South. Lincoln, I think, was speaking not only to the states who had already seceded, but the slaveholding states who had not yet seceded when he took office in March 1861. So that might be one lesson for Joe Biden is even if it doesn't work for everyone, it may work for some of the moderates.
Today, Joe Biden is not talking much about impeachment because my sense is he doesn't want to wade into that pool when it could hurt his ability to get his agenda through Congress. Different sets of circumstances, but two executives facing tough choices about just how far they should go towards reaching the other side.
Absolutely. And Lincoln, even though he did hold out that olive branch in his inaugural address and other times as well, there was a line beyond which he communicated he was not willing to cross. And specifically, you mentioned the expansion of slavery into new territories. Lincoln had always been firm, including during the election campaign and after it, that the expansion of slavery into new territories was off the table. So even though he's trying to reassure white Southerners, I'm not planning to, in fact, I don't think I have the authority as president to go after slavery in the states where it already exists. He is still remaining firm. He doesn't want to see it expand into new territories.
So however different the circumstances between now and then, what resonates in my eyes, if we bring this to the present, is that when our politics become so polarized, so zero-sum, where common ground eventually disappears, our country simply suffers. It did split in half. It was rescued by a war. There were some Northerners who urged Lincoln, just let the irredeemable South go its way. I don't know if that's possible today. We have to we have to come together, don't we? We have a pandemic to fight.
Yeah, I certainly agree with you there. And looking back to the 1850s and 60s, you can see the danger of the polarization cycle as being really difficult to break out of. This, of course, different regional identities in the North and the South had been present to some degree for decades before 1860. But as the fight over slavery heated up in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s, what you see is a quickening process of negative identity formation. Each side is defining itself against the other one. And the more terrible you depict the other side out to be, the better you look. And so that kind of cycle feeds itself. So the dangers of polarization were certainly evident then and should be heeded today, I think.
And both sides claim today and then certain terms or documents for themselves, certain ground for themselves. For instance, the South stood Thomas Jefferson and the Declaration of Independence on its head to justify slavery. Today, we're bickering over what unity means.
It's different interpretations of the same concepts. So back then, each side had different interpretations of the American Revolution, what the revolutionary generation had intended, what the documents like the Declaration of Independence ought to mean. Right now, as you say, unity is that key concept that people are talking about. Most people seem to be at least saying they want unity, and yet they have different ideas about how to achieve that.
A violent atmosphere surrounded Lincoln's inauguration. Same for Joe Biden. We saw what happened on January 6th, and it was fueled, at least in 1861, by conspiracies and paranoia in the North and South. We see conspiracy theories thriving today. What parallels do you draw there?
I would say there was more of a foundation back then than there are to some of these conspiracy theories that we've seen more recently. So both sides in the 1840s and 50s saw the other side as a threat to their kind of ideal America. In many cases, that involved their livelihoods. So when slaveholders looked at abolitionists and Republicans, they saw a threat to their livelihoods, identity, also sense of physical safety, especially after John Brown's raid in 1859. So there was a foundation there, but it was kind of inflated and blown up by the media. And then on the other side, many Northerners, including many of the ones who went into the Republican Party, when they looked to the South, they saw what they called a slave power, a kind of conspiratorial force of slaveholders who controlled national politics, who, even though they were in a minority in the nation, they were able to get their way. And there too, there was a foundation because white Southern slaveholders had dominated national politics. If you look at who was president between the Revolution and the Civil War, most of the time it was a white Southern slaveholder. So there was some foundation there, certainly more than the conspiracy theories we saw being followed at the Capitol last week.
And the result is the country comes apart. Our country today is shattered in many ways.
Yeah, and I would say one of the critical factors there is violence, physical violence. Back before the Civil War, there were various forms of violence that elevated and escalated the ideological conflict between the two sides. So, for example, there were anti-abolition mobs in some northern cities as well as southern cities in the 1830s and 40s. And then, of course, there were violent resistance to the Fugitive Slave Act in the 1850s. There's the prelude to civil war in Kansas in the mid-1850s when northern and southern forces are actively fighting against one another. There's the caning of Charles Sumner. There's Brown's raid. Each of these steps along the road to civil war, I think, shows the importance of physical violence in exacerbating this ideological difference.
I hope you're enjoying my conversation with Paul Quigley, who directs the Virginia Center for Civil War Studies at Virginia Tech. Paul, what did you think when you saw a protester hoisting a Confederate flag on January 6th?
Well, I wasn't entirely surprised, of course. Over the last few years, we've seen the Confederate flag used in many other contexts as an emblem of support for President Trump, of white supremacy, of opposition to civil rights, of opposition to federal government authority. So in a sense, it worked perfectly as the emblem for this movement. I think that the Confederate flag has become kind of a shorthand for a whole view of the world, a whole view of the United States that draws a lot from sort of the original use and meaning of the Confederate flag in the 1860s, but has also taken on a life of its own since then.
In the final settlement of the war was the end of Reconstruction in 1876. Came at the cost of black freedom, and that wound has festered. It's still festering today. So peace came at a terrible price in the 19th century. I wonder at what cost will political peace come today? I know historians predict at their peril, but why don't you take a shot at that?
Yeah, I mean, looking back to the post-Civil War decades, what happened was that peace came at the cost of Black Americans' rights and equality and freedom. And what happened was groups of white Americans basically reached an agreement to reconcile between themselves without acknowledging, the fundamental divide over slavery, racial ideology that had caused the war in the first place. So they left Black people out of that agreement, that kind of reconciliation process. And so the underlying problems of racism and slavery were left to fester, to grow worse, and are not going to go away unless they're resolved in any permanent sense.
To your point about having to find real common ground, there is a myth today, and it's embraced by millions of people, if we're to believe polls, and that is the election was stolen. And I can understand people on the fringes or QAnon pushing these ideas, but some Republican members of Congress who know better are giving oxygen to this lie. And it seems that if they don't accept the election as fair and square, we may never get anywhere here.
And I guess the comparison with Civil War history and really the memory of the Civil War is with the falsehoods at the center of lost cause ideology. Maybe most prominently, the idea that the Confederacy was not a pro-slavery entity is simply not true, but it's allowed people to come away from Civil War history with these distorted myths.
If you were Joe Biden's speechwriter, and I am certainly not, and either are you, but if you were, how would you try to approach his address to the nation when he finally now has the stage to himself?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and I don't think I'll ever be in that position.
It's okay if you can't. It's okay if you can't come up with constitutional eloquence off the top of your head.
No, that's fine. I can certainly have a try. One of the things I would think about actually is the concept of reconciliation, which is a word that's been used to describe, white Northerners and white Southerners following the Civil War agreeing to move on past the conflict. It's also a concept that's been applied to other conflicts, including other civil wars around the world. One of the research projects of mine that springs to mind here, a couple of years ago, I collaborated with a colleague to edit a collection of essays called Reconciliation After Civil Wars, Global Perspectives. So it was looking at different civil wars around the world, including the US Civil War, and looking at the processes of reconciliation following those conflicts and how difficult it can be to truly reconcile after a country has had a war basically with itself. And this is a very roundabout way of saying that what my message would be that reconciliation is based on justice, it's based on truth. It cannot be achieved just simply by papering over divisions with hollow talk about unity. It really requires that hard work of looking at the past, reckoning with the past, the wrongs that have been done in the past, and taking them seriously. That's not a good presidential speech, but that's what I can come up with right now.
That's pretty good, Paul Quigley at Virginia Tech. Thank you. On our next episode of History as It Happens, Trumpism after Trump. Will the former president maintain his influence over his voters and Republican office holders? But beyond Trump the man, what will become of Trumpism as a way of campaigning, governing, communicating, and as a narrative? That's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.